Okay, welcome everyone. Good afternoon from London. Welcome to our webinar, Rebuild, Reset, Recover. What role for digital technology? My name's Ian Hall. I'm editor of Global Government Fintech, which is a sister title to Global Government Forum. Both our publications report on trends and innovation in the public sector to serve our audience of civil servants around the world. We aim to provide an environment where our readers, or for our webinars, our viewers, can exchange ideas about what works and what doesn't. Global Government Fintech's website includes a section where we publish content on resilience, featuring news, views and reports on how digital technology can help build stronger societies and economies. Today's webinar is kindly supported by our knowledge partner, Mastercard, whose support enables us to offer this webinar free to public servants. Our hashtags for today are GovTech, digital government, economic recovery, and digital inclusion. We aim to allocate most of the time to questions from you, our audience, to make the webinar as interactive as possible. As questions occur to you, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window and type them in. Please do specify if you don't want us to use your name when we raise the question. Jennifer Duncan from Mastercard will be chairing the webinar, so I pass the floor to her to fully introduce the topic and our excellent speakers. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Ian, for that great introduction, and to the GGF team for enabling this discussion today. Now, every government is grappling with managing the economic and social consequences of COVID-19. Faced with the ongoing health crisis, economic headwinds, shifting social contracts and changing work environments, governments are expected to do more with less. Never before has impactful digitisation been more vital. I'm delighted to be joined today by representatives from the Government of Jersey and the Scottish Government, who I'll introduce shortly. They've generously agreed to spend the next hour sharing their own experiences with us. We also hope that this will only be the beginning of this discussion, as my comments today are drawn on Mastercard's experience of working on over 100 initiatives with governments and the public sector from 40 countries in response to the pandemic. In 2020, we worked with governments across the globe racing to protect the well-being and livelihoods of citizens and businesses, and continue to do so. This has been done by transforming the way they interact, delivering vital welfare payments to alleviate hardship, credit lines to keep small businesses going, and economic stimulus to mitigate the impact and accelerate recovery. Governments are harnessing payments technologies to solve welfare and financial stimulus challenges in the wake of COVID-19. Pensioners and the vulnerable have been able to stay at home. School children are being fed and educated, and businesses continue to trade. Governments have also been working with us to inform and understand the impact of the interventions they make, to target, to tailor, to plan. More transactions pass through our network each day than there are searches on Google. Not only do these transactions enable the digital economy, they generate anonymized and aggregated data to inform actionable insights. Analysis which many governments have been using to understand what's happening on the ground. Now, today we're joined by Alex Bunch, Payments Product Owner, Digital Directorate at the Scottish Government, and Senator John Lefondre, Chief Minister of the Government of Jersey, and Ian Burns, Director General, Customer and Local Services. I was going to trip over at some point. Now, these are two but perfectly formed countries who have much to share. The Scottish Government have found themselves in a unique position, being in the midst of establishing their digital payments infrastructure to support its newly created Department of Social Security as COVID-19 emerged. Has COVID-19 altered its approach, and will it help them to be better prepared for future crises? By contrast, the Government of Jersey have become a global leader in how they're managing the impact of the pandemic, being the first to issue a financial stimulus digitally to all citizens to protect against the economic ravages of COVID-19. What drove this decision, and what benefits do they expect to gain? Chief Minister, I'd like to hand over to you to introduce yourself, Jersey, and your digital journey.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So, hello everybody. Thank you very much to the Global Government Forum and Mastercard for facilitating this event. So I think just to start, for those who don't know, Jersey is a self-governing British Crown dependency. We're around the 3rd oldest parliament in the world, and we're basically independent. We set our own taxes, we control our own budgets. The UK remains responsible for defence and most of our international relationships, but it cannot legislate for us without our consent, and we really hugely value that relationship. We have a highly connected and outward-facing economy which excels in both financial and digital services. And so, for example, we enjoy the fastest broadband speeds in Europe, and we're the 3rd fastest globally. So in a sentence, Jersey has over 1,000 years of history, but remains at the cutting edge. Just in context, we're a small island, the population's around 105,000, and we're just off the coast of France, which hopefully you can see on the map behind me, with whom we've got close cultural and historical links. So history, culture, and community are important to us, but we're agile, we can act fast, and we sometimes market ourselves as Sandbox Island, particularly in the digital context. But it is true that many people will either have heard of either New Jersey, with whom we have good and strengthened relationships, or the Jersey cow. And the former was a territory founded by a Jerseyman in the mid-1660s, and the latter is the 2nd biggest dairy herd in the world. On that side, actually, it forms the basis of one of our biggest overseas aid projects in Africa, which is about significantly increasing milk yield, for example. People who are connected to the island include people like Dullaroo, the security printing society company started here, and Martel Cognac originated from a gentleman in Jersey who then went to France. But anyway, our biggest industry is financial services, and we are one of the best regulated places on the planet. And that is backed up, for example, by the IMF, World Bank, and Moneyval. And for example, we upstream about £500 billion FDI into the UK, which is worth around 5 billion annually to the UK exchequer. And presently, around £1 of every £100 of foreign direct investment into Africa comes through us. So when the pandemic started, we ramped up our broadband speeds for everyone to a gigabit a second without an increase in their tariffs. As a parliament, we went rapidly online for everything: debates, questions, voting, and briefings, becoming the first in the Commonwealth to sit entirely virtually. And the same can be said in respect to almost of our communications. So press conferences are live streamed, and they reach up to around 50% of the population at times. So that's definitely something for the future. And we've also held live question and answer minister sessions, again, with questions being sent in online and achieving far greater engagement than ever before. We've launched our own COVID app alert contact tracing app, which has had nearly a 50% uptake. And like many jurisdictions, we've used mass SMS messaging to send health messages directly to islanders. We've worked with Microsoft to develop a comprehensive border testing program, which has received international recognition. And this is something we've invested in very heavily. So we can now test around 10 to 15% of our population weekly and have a strong follow-up in contact tracing. So results are automatically sent to individuals either by email or text. Visitors are texted daily and they must respond, and results are turned around in approximately 7 hours. And the vaccination program has been rolled out with an online booking system to cope with mass appointments. As of Sunday, we're at just over 7% of the population. And then to start coming to the end of my sort of introduction, alongside Mastercard, we deployed what we call a spend local scheme, which contributed more than £10 million into our local economy. And so for that, we delivered a £100 prepaid electronic debit card to every man, woman, and child on the island. It was geographically restricted. It had to be spent within 6 weeks with local businesses. It's proved very, very popular. It caught the public imagination. And one of the advantages of it is that if we wish, it can be very easily topped up again if we want to do a further round of support. And actually, we've since held discussions with colleagues in Northern Ireland who I believe are planning to launch something similar at some point in the course of this year. So I hope that gives you a flavour of some of the ways in which Jersey has utilised digital technology during the COVID-19 pandemic and the context in which we're operating. And thanks everybody for listening to what I hope was a very brief introduction.
Fantastic. Now, Alex, you are looking at the situation from a different perspective because, as you said in the introduction, the Scottish Government were already embarking on their digital payments infrastructure transformation. So I'd love to hand over to you now for your introductory remarks as well.
Hi everybody, thanks a lot. I'm Alex Bunch. I'm product owner for the payments project in Scotland, and I'm very honoured to be speaking alongside the Chief Minister of Jersey, worth mentioning. To start with, I wanted to say and explain who we are. We're part of the Digital Directorate of the Scottish Government. And a couple of years ago, we embarked on a journey to discover whether it made sense to centralise and standardise payments. We did this with a user-centric vision, essentially stemming from the realization that users on the market evolve fast, and they tend to evolve very much ahead of government. And the angle we came on was, how can we respond to user needs and keep up with the market? And essentially look as well at how to be able to achieve this, we need to avoid locking into suppliers who sometimes result in lack of flexibility or inability to evolve. Now, on the payment space, what that meant was respond to users, we needed to think beyond the simple payment to a bank account. And without knowing where the users were actually going and what sort of use they might have in 10 years, and also taking into account the constraint of legacy systems across public sector organizations, it meant that we needed to look at a service which was capable to adapt with a variety of processes and multiple public sector organizations, but also being agnostic of payment network, whether it would need to facilitate for all organizations making payments to a bank account, to a prepaid card, overseas accounts, or through vouchers, without radically changing the processes of the various organizations. Where we're at the moment, we've entered our beta phase after 2 years of discovering the landscape and prototyping the technologies that we considered risky first. During that process, very early on, we made a 1 penny payment from one bank account to another to demonstrate that we could do this, and then set out on the journey to take this into a government grade service. So at this stage, we've got to a time when we're hoping to make the first payments to citizens by the end of this year. Now, for the purpose of today, I was asked to provide some feedback as to how this fits into the COVID-19 response. And I thought I'd look at an example. Last year, I was tasked to look into payment solutions because there was a specific need to support volunteers who were going grocery shopping for people who are shielding. We were told of cases where people were handing out their cards to volunteers and letting them know their PIN, which means that they were exposed to fraud. Now, we did at the time explore a number of suppliers, and eventually we recommended not to purchase any of the options proposed. And that basically came from the realization that we would not be able to, in a short space of time, propose a solution which would solve that specific problem. What it did is that, although I realize it might seem odd to talk about an instance when we failed to solve a problem, but on reflection, what it gave us is that we were able to recognize that we didn't have the capability on the payment space to be responsive and efficient, and buying something off the shelf was not going to change that. I think it's slightly different from the case of Jersey, where it's providing money to citizens, and as long as you're able to identify them, you can do that with a supplier, whereas they're having a specific journey that was to respond to a case of volunteers in a very new public sector space was not something that we were going to have the capability to be reactive on. But what we did realize is that if we'd had operational platforms, such as the payment platform or a digital identity platform, we might have been able to propose real solutions to that problem. And in retrospect, COVID was a concrete example that we think that the digital strategy that we're pursuing and the transformation journey that we're on is going in the right direction. And what we're aiming to do is for our platforms to do the heavy lifting where there is commonality, such as in payments, where many of the journeys resemble each other. And then for the rest of the public sector to focus on complexity, where the detailed knowledge of the users is effectively how you can deliver a good service. So that was the angle that I was coming on today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alex. Now, Alex, if I pick up, you also worked on a Scottish Government programme, which is leading now to the Best Start programme, didn't you? Now, this is a programme where I understand that pregnant and new mothers get access to additional financial support for vitamins, for fruit, for vegetables, etc. Are you aware of how that programme has been performing? Because I understand that following the performance of the Scottish Government, England and Wales and Northern Ireland will be following suit, because similar to Jersey, it's using the same technology, but actually targeting support at a particular issue and problem to be able to support those individuals in the means that the government's looking for.
Yes, so I think you're talking about the healthy food vouchers, which are attached to the Best Start grant benefits. I was working on the Best Start grant benefit when it initially, in the initial stages of the project. I didn't have the opportunity to work specifically on the vouchers, but what these are prepaid cards that are topped up on a weekly basis and can be used in a certain way in a shop. And I think that the aim is that, as it is a health subsidy, it is intended purpose is to be used in a certain way, and using a supplier AllPay, the Scottish Government is able to top up regularly in the small amounts, that weekly amounts that provide this payment. I know that the scheme is live. I know that it's going well. I wouldn't actually be able to comment any further in terms of the detail, because in the past couple of years I've not been close to what they've actually delivered. Now, today it's a scheme that they've done independently of the payment service, because we're not live yet, but we could envisage that tomorrow, whether it's Social Security with the healthy food vouchers or any other organization that wishes to have a prepaid card or a voucher system or any other form of payments, that we would be able to wire it into the payment service. And that's where the platform comes in, because we will standardize every payment, make it agnostic in terms of how you're paying your citizen. And the idea is that tomorrow the citizen is going to move towards a different mechanism. I'm not entirely sure whether my children tomorrow will have a bank account, because we don't know where that market is going. But on the other hand, we can standardize the way in which the government is going to interact with the market.
I think that's a fantastic explanation, Alex, and really talks to that point you made earlier about agility and giving yourself the ability to be agnostic and deal with a myriad of different challenges. Chief Minister, picking up on Alex's explanation about the Best Start grant, they were using the same technology there as you're using in Jersey with your COVID financial stimulus response. I just wonder, could you share your thinking about what actually drove you to make the decision on that technology? And thinking about the perspective of Northern Ireland, if you were to give them one piece of advice or one watch out for embarking on this journey, what would that be?
Right, so when we were dealing, if you like, with what we've tried to avoid calling the first wave, but as we were coming out in sort of April, May time, and obviously talking about the need for doing some form of fiscal stimulus. And we looked at various options, and one of them, for example, was, so obviously, as we said, we set our own taxes. So we have it's a goods and services tax. It's similar, but not quite the same to VAT. And it's a very low rate, it's about 5%. So one of the suggestions at that point was to reduce it down to 3% or reduce it down to 0. And the concern I have to say I particularly had, and I think other ministers and officers did as well, is that how do you guarantee that gets to the citizen? So how do you guarantee that effectively a shopkeeper is going to reduce their prices from £1 down to 95p or whatever it is. And equally, my background is I'm an accountant, so I'm a bit worried about saying this. It didn't seem very exciting either. But and so fairly soon we moved to a position of going for some form of voucher scheme, and then we get into the logistics. How do you use them? How do you control them? What's the kind of security around it? How do you get people to spend? And that is where certainly Ian and his team came up with a solution, obviously working with Mastercard and with the supplier of the cards themselves. But and when we heard this, to be blunt, we were blown away, because they came out and said, we can do it electronic. We can get it, we can control it so it can be time limited. So these things can expire on a certain day. We can actually restrict it geographically, so it can only be used in Jersey. And actually, in the instance we've done, we the only restriction we put on it after due consideration was gambling. So you could not use the card for gambling. But you get into those discussions, well, should you allow alcohol or cigarettes? And it kind of gets very, very tricky. And what's the difference between what you're encouraging versus somebody going in and buying a bottle of wine from a wine retailer, essentially, or wholesaler or whatever. And but that is all part of the economy. And what you're trying to do, you're trying to get money out in as quick a method as we can to support business at that time emerging and hopefully after the summer and supporting them generally going forward. The decision to do every man, woman and child, the child I also felt was important, because again, it brought into for want of a better expression, the excitement factor. It generated a lot of interest. And again, it meant that you don't get into this kind of difficulties of trying to determine if you start at 16-year-olds for the sake of argument, what do you do with somebody who turns 16 between when you announce it and when you issue the cards, and what happens to the person who's missed by a day? You then get the issues as well around, we did consider, and this might be one to think about for Northern Ireland actually, is what do you do about fraud? So in other words, what happens if the cards go to a wrong person? Now, there were some security measures put around it, and I'm sure Ian can talk to that if he wishes to, but fundamentally, when you stand back from it, it doesn't matter to an extent, because it's time limited and you want the money spent. You can't save it, you can't put it into a bank account. So as long as the money is spent in the economy, and you want to be careful here, if you have a 95% success rate in our terms, that probably means that 5,000 people don't get the card, which can create quite a lot of noise. But you've got to accept that you actually want them, as long as those cards do go out and are spent in the economy, in the macro sense, it doesn't matter. Obviously, what we've tried to do is minimize that as well. And just finally, and I know I've talked quite a lot there, is that the other measure. So one of the other measures we put in place actually was we reduced social security rates by around 2% for all employees. That has, even though financially that's far better for everybody, that has not garnered any amount of attention or excitement in what we've done, whereas the card actually was a huge success. And I will say, and all credit to Ian and his team as well, and everybody involved, and said, including Mastercard and the card supplier, which was PFS. The turnaround time in that was fantastic as well. It was all done in quite a short number of weeks. But as I said, overall, it was a really good success. But that gives you some of the thinking behind why we went down that way, rather than, for example, other mechanisms that we could have considered.
So many learnings there. Ian, would you like to pick up on the fraud point?
Yes, I mean the fraud point was the risk was fairly limited given the amount of money on the cards, and the fact it could only be spent on Ireland. So somebody would have had to work quite hard to accumulate enough cards to make it worthwhile. And obviously people were looking out for the cards. So from that perspective, it was a low risk. Once we selected the prepaid debit card approach, then it was something that we didn't really have to worry about. Whereas with vouchers or using QR codes, potentially there were much bigger risks around that. I think one of the, building on the Chief Minister's response, I think one of the biggest advantages for us was that businesses would be able to accept the card, they'd be used to already accepting Mastercards, and therefore would be able to find an ease of access to try and encourage business to come their way, and also get the cash quickly. That was the other part of the scheme, was to help support businesses get cash flow, and therefore it was a very easy, popular solution when we decided upon going down the road with Mastercard prepaid cards. I think the advice to Northern Ireland, which we have already spoken to them and shared this, was around data. Actually, we put an awful lot of work in very quickly to try and make sure we could get cards out to people directly and limit the number of people who needed to apply for the spend local card. That way around. So we were trying therefore to crunch data across government, and we were able to issue quite a lot of cards, nearly enough cards for everybody at the beginning, even though we knew some people wouldn't be here. So we were also able to take some risk, but that was the key bit. I think that was the thing that made our scheme the success.
And I think it's worth also saying, in terms of the excitement factor, what you then had businesses doing, they might come and say, we'll spend £100 of us and we'll make it 110 or 120 pounds. So you effectively got a built-in discount as well. I think what we've also seen, and this is a little bit anecdotal, this one, because it's difficult to prove, is that the emphasis we put out was also try and use it to treat yourself. And I think on the whole that worked. That was probably what we saw. But so there will certainly been circumstances where we'll have just seen the £100 that would have been spent, but potentially £150. So the extra 50, somebody's put into the economy on top of that, because from their point of view, they've had a substantial discount on what they've bought. They might have gone and bought a new sofa or something, or whatever, or a fridge or something. But because they've had £100 off, or if the family have combined those cards, that's allowed them to make quite bigger purchases. But you won't see the extra stimulus of that, whatever the money above that £100 limit. We haven't been able to pick that up in our data, but anecdotally, we think that there was extra stimulus that came through as a result of that. So it's very easily understandable, I think, was the other point, is that, and we had, well, I suppose my children were fairly well informed about the subject because they knew some of the discussions as they were announced, shall we say. But the feedback I got was that there was quite a lot of excitement down in the school age territory, obviously, and who wouldn't? If you're a 14-year-old and you get given £100, that's which you have to spend, and that of course then fed into the households as well.
See, I don't think you have to be 14 to be delighted about getting £100. I'm sure you had many delighted citizens and residents on the island. I have been given a nudge to remind the audience that they are welcome to ask questions themselves. So if you have questions for the panel, then please do put them in the chat. Now, in the meantime, while we're waiting for some additional questions, Alex, can I return to you? So I know you're really keen to share some of your experience around suppliers.
Yes, and first of all, to confirm that I would have been excited with £100 in this situation too. But yes, I mean, it was worth noting in terms of the Scottish Government payments project that when we set out jointly with a newly formed digital commercial service to explore different ways of buying digital. I mean, one of the realizations that we had as in the user-centric vision, if we want to serve users, if we want to propose things that will correspond to their use, is that we also need to be able to buy things off the shelf or buy things on the market that will correspond to that. I mean, typically in government, what we tend to do is we do frameworks of contracts that are for a certain number of years, and once we've negotiated a framework, things tend to be relatively closed. Not always, but it is a very common pattern. And what we realized on the payment space in particular is that the market was made up by a certain number of payment services providers or fintech organizations that never featured on our frameworks, and therefore to be able to work with them, they would usually need to partner with some of the usual suspects, big organizations that we tend to use as integration partners. So we've been doing quite a lot of work from that point of view to explore what are the other more dynamic ways that we could interact with the market. It's fair to say that a lot of the work that was going on was dropped because of COVID, because we then repurposed the knowledge that we'd built around that to use in our COVID response. So the people from the digital commercial service I was working with went on to purchase or support procurement in other areas that were not payments, but we're going to pick this back up to learn from the market, see how we need to buy. Very often we realize that the pricing models and the way that the market wants to work with us is not the one that we'd envisaged, and how can we work with them to arrive at models that actually suit in terms of the use and the sort of technology that we're talking about.
And what's been the greatest challenge that you've faced so far with building the programme? Obviously, you've got the goal by getting payments out by the end of the year. What has been the most challenging element of the programme so far?
I think the making a payment is not something that was very difficult for us to do. So we started off on the tail end of 2018. We brought our first supplier on in February 2019, and in May we made a payment through a prototype or proof of concept for the payment service. So that particular technology point was something that was relatively complex. I think that there's two challenges if there's something that we can look at. One of them is the essentially the working with multiple organizations, and it's not that their own payment processes are complex individually. Each payment process can be tackled in the same way as we would tackle the first payment process that we did. They're usually slightly different, but we know how to deal with them. It's more to do with within the public sector to engage with multiple organizations at the same time is an exercise which in itself is complex, even when you work from inside the government. And I think that public sector workers on this call will probably recognize this sort of thing. I think one of the other difficulties is changing the minds and perceptions of co-workers in other organizations. I mean, essentially, everybody knows that the digital world is going in a direction which is very, very fast. We see this at home. We ourselves change our devices all the time. We change our ways of working, but we're always very reticent as public servants to take the risk to go into a direction that hasn't been taken by somebody else before. In that sense, it's particularly difficult for colleagues who do this when they have an estate that they already have to manage. I mean, I think we were in a comfortable situation, is that we went into this completely greenfield, and we went into, let's see what we can do with the latest technology. And to start with, let's see if the latest thing works. Let's see if it's robust. Let's see if it can work with 30-year-old technology as well, and how can we interact from that point of view. So it was quite a comfortable situation to go in, but we still have a cross of worlds from that point of view, where it's fair to say that people are comforted by things that have already been done before, and when you step into the unknown, it's very difficult to make a decision.
I think all of our panelists have definitely proven the case that it's worthwhile being a leader in this space, that it's reaping rewards for their economies and for the citizens they're serving. Just with a slight pivot, we've had a question come in the question and answer box. Apparently I said the chat box, so I've had my wrist slapped for that, because that's a different function. You send your questions, unsurprisingly, to the question and answer box. We have a question in from Dermot Meehan, and Dermot has asked, for Jersey, do you know which sectors of the economy have benefited most from the card spend?
Be a combined answer, I think, because I think Ian's got all the details on his screen in front of him. But We do know that I'm going to say around 20% went into, I think it's defined as food retail, which is something we might want to think about. But obviously hospitality did get a lot of spend as well. And I'll just make 2 points actually, then Ian can give some of the breakdown. Number one is that one of the attractions of the scheme is that if we want to, and I think it's more than possible, we haven't quite got to the probable point yet, we can top up very easily. So essentially, at this stage, it is certainly not beyond the bounds of possibility that we're doing a phase 2 on this. And probably, I'm going to guess in Easter, but that might be a bit early. We don't know yet, but it's certainly within our thinking. The other point was that obviously, in terms of our discussions, we did wonder whether we'd need to restrict it more. In the first round, we decided not to because we wanted doing a broad spread. And if people did need extra support, if there were families that were struggling, we had already paid some money out through the benefit system to them directly as a separate payment. So they actually all got £100 per individual household, I think, or per individual in a household. And that was about £1 million for the economy. And then on top of that, they then got the spend local card as well. So the food retail as a large chunk doesn't surprise me, but obviously 80% of it didn't go into food retail and went into a whole range of other areas. And I'll cue in at that point.
Yeah, so retail was a major beneficiary. So about 40% of all the spend went to retail, and about 15%, 16% went to hotels, restaurants, and bars. So the three big chunks were covered by those. There was I think the point is, and one of the benefits of issuing it to the cast of children, we've seen that there is a very wide spread across the island, both across Jersey's a small place, but we could see it being spent all over, as well as the main town and the main shopping centre. So that was very positive. I think the other point is that we have through this scheme some very rich data. Yes, we've looked at things at sectorial level, but we can obviously go into different levels underneath that to understand. And if we wanted to operate the scheme differently, we can target it to specific sectors, or even by location if we wanted to. So it's really positive that we have that flexibility, and it does show that we can target the government's and taxpayers' funds in the right way to get the best value for money out of that spend. It's all those options are open to us. I think that's the really important thing with this technology.
Yeah, so I've another question on the back of that. Beyond COVID, how do you think that data could be useful in future? And thinking about the programme, is there anything you would do differently if you do decide to run the programme for a second time? Everyone's now got their fingers crossed for a second at £100 at some point. But is there anything that you would do differently in terms of how the scheme worked and how it was communicated to actually elicit a different response, or something you felt didn't work quite as well as you would like first time around?
I mean, I'm going to say from a political level that I think the only question might be, and we have not had that discussion, whether you might look at whether you might want to restrict the food retail side a bit more than we did. I think that's a discussion to be had for the reason I kind of elaborated in the first question. Other than that, from a political level, I think the communication, the fact that the communication level, I think, was very good. So there's not actually too much of a change on that front because of the level of uptake and the level of excitement that was there. It was definitely regarded as a successful element. At the operational level, I don't know if there were areas. I'll hand it to Ian if there are areas to improve on.
Yeah, so I think one of the things was surprised us. We did test out capacity in the activation process, but the cards were a lot of cards were activated on the same day, exactly the same moment, and it did just briefly cease to work for about 45 minutes. But it just shows the enthusiasm for it, and I think it shouldn't be underestimated how important it was having a physical a card. Actually, I know we had the option to have virtual cards, and that was something we did consider, but actually having a physical card was something that people they therefore could put in their wallet. I mean, you can still see them today. They're in people's wallets around the island, waiting, hopefully, for the Chief Minister's announcement, which you may have just had. But waiting, but it means that people were going to go and do something with it, as well as spend the £100. It was something that they could pick up and move around, and children particularly, I think, were appreciative of that. We've obviously, thankfully, a sensible thing was we had an expiry date of October 2022. So we did buy ourselves the option to for adults to be able to top the card up again in the future and give us 2 years before we have to replace the card. So the other important message was to keep the card if you're on island. So it went as well as could be expected overall. And we are really pleased with the operational execution of it and the support we got from both Mastercard and prepaid financial services.
I suppose looking ahead is in terms of how we use that data for going forward. I think that's yet to come. I think for all of us, we're still working our way out through COVID. Our priorities at the moment are get the vaccination program running, keep maintaining the testing regime that we've got in place. But going forward, we have got plans around economic recovery, both short term and long term. And I'm sure that data between the change in the organisation that we'd started pre-COVID, which has certainly ramped up hugely in terms of technology and how that's being applied. I think I'm sure that data will form a very rich basis, and I think the economists are salivating almost at the data they've received.
And I think I've met one of your, well, in fact, your chief economist before, so I know that it's going to be true, having had discussions.
If it's Nick, yes.
A great appetite for doing interesting things and seeing how you can progress and use these innovative tools. Now, we've had another question come in, and I think it's for everyone, but Alex, I'll come to you first. So it's from Kezia Watson, and Kezia has asked, how do you think public servants can be encouraged to take a leap into digital where no one has done it before, particularly when some organizations are still far behind on even more basic things like data sharing?
Yes, it's a very interesting question, and I think that it is something that most public sector organizations have been through. I suspect that the way I look at it is when because you talk about a leap into digital, and I think that from the outside, when you're looking at a transformation, it looks like something very, very big and inachievable. And I think that the way to be able to do that is to break it down into smaller chunks that are achievable. It's essentially, you start on something small that you can get to know, because nobody is superhuman, and even the biggest teams, if they try to tackle too many things at once, will usually fail to succeed as well as they would normally do. And you take a small bit, you learn how to do that one well, and once you know how to do that one, you can expand. Now, in a sense, it's to reflect on what we're doing on payments. A couple of years ago, when we set out to look at what we were doing, the remit was not necessarily payments. We had an intuition that payments was where we were going to go, but it was essentially look at the transformation of the financial estate and what are the options that can come out. And naturally, the options that came out was that a transformation of the full financial estate was something that was not imaginable for us to tackle at that particular point. And even on the payment space, when we looked at the payment space, we looked at, well, we could do card payments, we could do direct debits, we could do backs, direct credits, and so forth. And the list of things that we could do was quite long. And from that point of view, we started by looking at where are the points where there is most value. And that was by looking in data. And essentially, we realized that 90% of the payments that we were set to make or receive in the public sector at a 5-year horizon, particularly with Social Security coming in, were going to be payments to UK bank accounts. So we started to focus on that. So even though I was talking about being flexible, being able to integrate different technologies, being able to integrate vouchers and cards into our space, in terms of our roadmap, we're very clearly tackling those as we go along. And we're starting with payments backs payments to UK bank accounts. And that is what we're focusing on at the end of this year. We're hoping that a year following that we'll have onboarded other different types of mechanisms, but that's how we're tackling payments, which if you look at the full financial picture compared to everything else that you could do, where you could have asset management, you could have debt, you could tackle all sorts of things to do with compliance or general ledger accounting and financial reporting. If we look at that picture and start to try and do that, then it is a leap, and it is something that is very difficult to achieve. Even with a lot of investment, it's something that can fail. There are examples around the world with governments that have invested sums that are far beyond the sort of investments that we're putting into this project, that have dropped them because they realized that they were trying to tackle too much at the same time. So, I mean, the advice would be to say, start small, fail fast if you're going to fail, because if what you're doing is wrong, you should stop it. But at least if you've invested a minimal amount of money into doing it, it doesn't matter so much that it's not being successful.
Makes perfect sense. So I'm taking from that bite-sized chunks is the way to go. Thank you. So Chief Minister Ian, what's the Jersey perspective on that one?
I'll give the politician's view, and then we'll hear the operational point as well. I think to an extent there's a factor as well, particularly after what we've all gone through on COVID. Over the last 10, 11 months now, we don't have any choice about pushing things forward. The fact, I suppose the example I'll use, and I don't mean it in any derogatory sense in any shape or form, and I say that just in case our local media watches this at some point. But if we've taken, as I said, the states, the Parliament of Jersey, the fact that we've taken a very disparate range of technological abilities there, because you've got every age range you can think about, and they are all now, despite even occasionally still having the odd unmuted microphone at probably the wrong time, but they are all doing. We use Teams generally rather than Zoom. We are having full parliamentary sessions online now. To have suggested in the middle of 2019 that the entire assembly wouldn't be meeting physically, that we were having all these debates and all these type of things, and or doing members briefings and all the rest of it that we've been doing in the last good number of months, I think shows then that even the most reticent in terms of technology can make those changes. I think, and so that's kind of so at the political level, it's very difficult for people to say it can't be done, because actually a lot of it we've done in the last 10, 11 months. I think within all that lot as well, you've then got the culture of the organisation. And we work and are going through a kind of cultural change program, essentially, to try and essentially, if you like, embrace change. And all I can say is that as possibly as a skeptical politician in the past, and when I first came in, I started at the end of 2005. But in terms of what I see in the organisation, particularly in times of COVID, I am really proud of what everybody has done, and I mean that genuinely. Because and I'm moving away from payments, but if I look at some of the areas where, as I said, our testing regime, where I think at the very beginning we were starting off at trying to get 150 tests, I can't remember if it was a day or a week, and now we're testing between 12 and 15,000 a week. And you look at there have been mistakes along the way, but it's about not being afraid to make those mistakes and to keep trying. I think that's probably the most important thing. And one thing that can be very daunting is that so something goes wrong and you'll get a couple of complaints, and the media particularly will start being critical. But you've got to keep that in perspective. You've got to say, yes, we learned from that and we keep moving forward. And that's where we've been. As I said, our testing regime has been absolutely fantastic, trying to speed up things and looking at all the processes and things like that which have gone through. So the how is, I don't think we've got too much choice. I think it's making sure the culture is there. That's got to come from the very top. I think education is important, and that's about media and social media, and that's in terms of how you manage that. I will say, and it's something I want quite keen to see this year, is that certainly from the island's point of view, the population's point of view, they don't quite understand what government actually does. I know that sounds absolutely stupid. When you actually work through everything that does happen within the organisation, and that's something we need to learn around communication even more. And so from that perspective, teaching them, saying this is all these services, all these things are done for you, and this is why we need to make the changes going forward. So it's about having the right culture, having the communication, and not being afraid to make the mistakes, which sometimes can lead to criticism, provided we learn from that and we can demonstrate that going forward as well. Yeah.
So I think COVID has provided quite a lot of challenges, but it's also led to some very different ways of working, particularly at pace. And the other key part really is around risk appetite. So some of these schemes, I mean, we didn't know, for example, when we did set up to do the spend local card, that they hadn't been done anywhere else in the world. Probably if it had, it might have put us off a bit. But we were operating with an increased risk appetite because of the nature of the scheme. So we were willing to accept more risk, and we had the support to say if it didn't quite work out, then that would be acceptable. Obviously, we worked very hard to make sure it didn't. But I think in relation to all our other COVID activity, we've been designing things, as Alex mentioned earlier on, with the customer at the very centre of our design work. So if in doing that, you do kind of design out some of the potential risks by focusing on the customer and making it easy for the customer. And I think that's the really important thing that's driven us through all our COVID activities is just trying to work quickly and design it around the customer. And then those two things work together to mean you come up with much better solutions than you might have done had you been in a pre-COVID, more risk adverse, more siloed approach in some respects in government.
Yeah, that totally chimes with our experience of working with governments. I think the pace of change and the willingness to move at pace has been huge, and putting the customer at the centre of it. What is it that we're trying to solve for, and how quickly can we get it done? Thinking about that point about customer, so the Chief Minister mentioned the varying abilities in terms of digital capability. And I think both Ian and Alex, you've talked about the customer in terms of what you're looking to deliver and have delivered. Were there any issues and challenges, say with more vulnerable groups, older people, etc., that you had to consider? Because I know quite often, especially older people, are assumed that digitisation is a challenge, where we've worked with governments, for example, Israel and Chile, where they focused on digitising pensions, for example, because when you're asking people to shield and stay at home, you need to give them a means to do so. Because Alex used the example about fraud and, people handing over their cards to third parties and trusting them not to abuse that opportunity. So actually helping older people, vulnerable people to upskill and digitize has been a huge part of the pandemic response, and we've seen it done really successfully. Have you got any learnings that you would share with the audience in that space?
Yeah, I mean, so in terms again of the Spend Local Card campaign, we made sure there were two routes to activate the card. And obviously using the card, we'd hope that people would be able to be used to that. But to activate the card, we allow people to activate it online or use a free phone number. And we gave people that choice. And actually 2/3 of people went online, which is very interesting. Although that did change, that percentage, the older you got. So that, to be accepted in some respects, that we did make the free phone was very, very easy, admittedly. So I think there's acknowledgement that that in a way that's a helpful test piece of data for government, that there are adopters, there are people who want to transact online even at the age of 90 plus, and indeed large percentages of people who are 90 plus wanted to and did activate their cards online, but there's still a way to go before you can assume everybody can. And that's just to build that into the design, really, to think about digital first applications, but recognize that we need to provide the routes for people who are not yet digitally enabled.
In the wider context, it's a challenge, and again, politically, it's a challenge because you will always find a cohort, and it might only be, when I say only, might be 7,000 people or something, but that's still in our context, that's still 7% of the population roughly, and you've got to make sure you cater for them. Now, obviously, over time, and for all of us, things move on. But I can think within my family, I can think of one person who's in their late 80s who uses Skype to see her relatives down in Australia, and therefore, I presume, therefore has email addresses and all the rest of it. I don't actually know that bit. That's an assumption. Whereas I can think of another member of my family who does not have a computer and refuses to have anything to do with them. And so it's how you cater for that. But and I think that's the point that Ian's making as well, is making sure that there is an alternative way to access the service you're providing. So on the Spend Local, the fact that you can actually use the phone to do it, adjusted to that need.
Fantastic. Alex, I could see you were waving at me, keen to come in on this one.
Yes, I think there's a few things that we could say on that. And one of them is you referred to the example I used about people who were shielding, and whether we could provide a payment solution that was going to assist that. And I can remember having conversations at that point where it was, well, we could still provide a solution, and even if it doesn't suit everybody, and the particular use case was, what about somebody who is not digitally literate and who doesn't know how to top up their card and who doesn't know how to send funds to a volunteer so that they can go and do shopping on their behalf? And the arguments were, well, that's a minority. We would at least be providing a solution for a large proportion of people who are shielding. And the realization was actually, well, out of the people who are shielding, these are typically people who are going to be either older or in vulnerable groups, and you're typically talking about a higher proportion of people who are don't access a digital capability. And I think that's to be said, is when we were looking at that, is having specific insights into that was really useful. From that point of view, and I think Ian mentioned as well, digital first, I presume it's the same thing as with us, where we're talking about different standards that we work to. And that's all to do with making sure that we design inclusively, so that our resources are accessible and that the services that we propose can be used with the likes of screen readers, can be used with people with various disabilities for which there is assistive technology that is there and that works, but we need to make sure that the way we design our services can operate them. In the payment space, there's the specific indexing of a table or a bank statement that means that a screen reader can actually navigate down it. That's a particular issue in that area. And the last point on that, to say that we started looking as well as wiring different payment mechanisms. The background to this is that we were looking as to how we could address the unbanked. I mean, typically you're talking about people who either don't have a bank account or don't have a bank account that they can use because they're in a situation of debt, or in some cases don't want to access a bank account. There are various religious, or because you don't want to access a bank card, or other reasons for which people have never engaged with the banking sector. And the idea was to look at payment service providers that are addressing this space. Whether it be digital, whether it be voucher-based, doesn't really matter. In a sense, we should be able to reach out to all citizens or users. And when the Chief Minister was saying, well, 7% is 7,000 people, that's a big deal in Jersey. And I think it's the same everywhere else. As long as you design a service that is going to be inclusive, you're on the right track.
Fantastic.
That's precisely the point.
Yeah. I am conscious of time, so we've got 1 minute left, and I did suddenly see us getting a little drop in attendees, which usually means the bell's about to ring and everyone's rushing off to their next meeting. But just one last quick fire from everybody. If you could digitize one thing in 2021, what would it be? Silence. I mean, I think, Jersey, you've already digitized Parliament, payments. What's next on the agenda?
I think that was, well, that's why I was struggling a bit, because what have we got left to do? I think one of the big challenges, whether we'll get it done in 2021 or not, is with the so with the fiber setup we've got, we are experimenting with faster speeds as well, and then how we can use that from the healthcare provision, and how we can use that technology to bring that through. I think that would be a priority. I think that might be ambitious for 2021, mind you, but
Yeah,
it will be on the agenda at some point.
definitely. Alex, will we go to you for a final word?
Well, I'm hoping to digitise payments because that is what is on my target for this year.
No pressure there. Everyone's going to be watching what the Scottish Government get up to in that space. Good luck, and I would say thank you to our three panelists for being so generous with your insights and your advice, for all the government civil servants that have taken time to join today. The details of today's meeting will be available from GGF. They'll post this webinar so everyone can share it far and wide so they can learn from all your thoughts today. So I think with that, we'll draw the meeting to a close. Thank you very much to everyone for joining today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.